When we talk about social control, or I guess how an entrenched power structure keeps an entire population in check, our minds almost immediately go to censorship.
No, absolutely.
Right. Like, we picture the classic heavy-handed authoritarian playbook.
Yeah.
Book burnings in the town square, or heavily restricted internet firewalls.
State-run media wiping out the facts.
Exactly. We tend to think of a system where the evidence of reality is literally locked away in a vault somewhere, guarded by armed men.
It's the instinctual assumption we make about tyranny, I think. The belief that to completely dominate a society, a ruling class must first, completely suppress the data.
But here is where it gets really interesting. Because when you look at the absolute most sophisticated, the most insidious form of anti-rational social control, it doesn't bother hiding the evidence at all.
Right, it doesn't need to.
The evidence is sitting right there in broad daylight. You literally trip over it on your way to work. Instead, the control mechanism is entirely psychological.
So how does that work exactly?
Well, it involves convincing the public that this universally available evidence requires special access, or like special training, or a specific institutional credential to actually interpret.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it is the ultimate monopolization of meaning.
Right.
The system essentially tells the community, yes, there is an observable reality all around you. You can see it with your own eyes, but you absolutely cannot understand what it means without going through us.
Yes, the gatekeepers.
Exactly. We are the gatekeepers. We are the credentialed experts, the institutional interpreters.
And think about the modern equivalence of this. It reminds me a lot of the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. The bankers and the rating agencies didn't hide the data on those subprime mortgages. I mean, the data was technically out there.
But they wrapped it in so much dense jargon.
Yeah, this impenetrable, credential-walled jargon. They basically told the public, you don't have the advanced math degrees to understand why these collateralized debt obligations are a good idea. Just trust us.
And that creates a permanent, lifelong dependency on those gatekeepers.
Totally. You start to doubt your own eyes. You start to believe your own cognitive apparatus is just insufficient to process reality.
Which brings us directly to the foundational text we are unpacking today for this deep dive.
I'm really excited for this one.
We are undertaking a rigorous, high-energy dissection of a fascinating framework for civilizational survival. Specifically, we are looking at the mid-20th century scholar Ghulam Ahmed Parvez.
Right.
And his lecture 10, which analyzes a sequence in Surah Al-Furqan, basically verses 41 through 46.
And before we go any further, I need to set the ground rules for you, the listener, right out of the gate. Because if you hear Surah Al-Furqan, you might assume we are about to do some kind of theology show.
We are not.
We are definitely not. We are stepping completely away from religious sentimentality today. There will be zero theological preaching here.
None at all.
The title Al-Furqan literally translates to the criterion, or the standard of judgment. And Parvez, who was writing in an era where newly forming nations were trying to build functional societies from scratch, he viewed this text as a structural blueprint.
Yeah, a highly practical one.
So our mission today is to take this text and run it strictly through the lens of sociology, systems engineering, and cognitive architecture.
We are reading this as a diagnostic manual, basically.
Exactly. A manual on how human communities process reality, how they collapse, and how power structures manipulate meaning.
It is a profound shift in perspective. I mean, when you treat the text as a sociological diagnostic tool, you realize it is fundamentally about the mechanics of human reason versus institutional tyranny.
Right.
To break down this system of social control we just discussed, the credentialing of meaning, we have to look at the exact countermeasure the text provides.
And where is that found?
It's found right in the culmination of verses 41 through 46. Parvez highlights this sequence as containing one of the most intellectually democratic statements ever recorded.
Okay, I love that term. Intellectually democratic.
Right. Verse 45 asks a painfully simple, almost shockingly grounded question. It says, and this is the Arabic first, Alam tara ila rabbika kaifa madal oya, which means, do you not see how your Lord extends the shadow?
Okay, let's unpack this, because on a first read, that feels, well, incredibly anticlimactic.
It does, yeah.
I mean, think about the magnitude of what is usually discussed in ancient foundational texts. You expect massive cosmological mysteries.
Right. Burning bushes and parted seas.
Exactly. You expect abstract riddles about the nature of the unseen or descriptions of multidimensional beings. But the text doesn't point to the esoteric, it points to a shadow. Why a shadow?
The mundane nature of the shadow is precisely the point. It is not a cosmological phenomenon that requires a billion-dollar space telescope to observe.
Right.
It is not a philosophical concept that requires decades of institutional study to parse. It is a shadow. The exact same shadow that every single person living on the surface of the earth has observed every single day of their lives.
Regardless of their education.
Regardless of their education, their wealth, their zip code, or their social standing.
So it bypasses the gatekeepers entirely?
Completely. Parwes frames this as the ultimate archetype of democratic evidence. It's an open-source beta set that no ruling class can put behind a paywall.
That is such a powerful way to look at it.
Let's look at the systemic versus superstitious dynamic here. The sequence continues into verse 46, observing how the shadow extends and then saying, then we draw it back easily.
Okay.
What is being described is not magic. It is not an omen. It is the observable behavior of light and geometry. The shadow extends and contracts according to a precise, measurable, universal law.
I see where this is going. You don't need a PhD in optics, and you certainly don't need a high priest's blessing to understand that a tree casts a long shadow at 10 a.m., a short one at noon, and another long one in the opposite direction at 4 p.m.
Exactly. You just need eyes.
It acts according to consistent, non-negotiable principles. So if the institutional interpreters are telling the community, reality is chaotic, the gods are angry, the market is unpredictable, you must pay us to interpret the omens for you.
The shadow is the ultimate proof that they are lying.
Right.
It establishes an epistemological baseline. It demonstrates that the rational order of the universe is accessible to anyone willing to apply their basic faculties of observation.
Which is terrifying to a gatekeeper.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The shadow doesn't care if a king is standing next to it or a peasant. It moves exactly the same way. It cannot be bribed.
It cannot be lobbied.
Right. It cannot be legislated out of existence by a corrupt parliament.
Yeah.
It operates independently of any vested interest class.
It's just geometry functioning effortlessly. But if this open source evidence is so undeniable, so universally accessible, it begs a massive historical question. Well, we are talking about the context of 7th century Mecca, where this message was first delivered. If someone just comes along and says, hey, look at the shadow, look at the universal laws of nature, use your own reason to navigate reality.
Right.
Why does that trigger a multi-decade war? I mean, why the economic blockades, the assassination attempts, the sheer unadulterated hostility toward the messenger?
To understand the sheer violence of the pushback, Parwes takes us deep into the sociological and economic data of that specific society.
Yeah.
We have to strip away the myth that the opposition in Mecca was about abstract theology or how people prayed.
Okay, because that's usually how it's taught.
Right, but the historical record is explicit. Mecca at that time was a massive cosmopolitan trading hub. You had Jews, Christians, Magians, and various polytheists all living in relative proximity.
Really?
Yeah, they were operating their own temples and practicing their own rituals.
Wait, so Mecca was functionally a pluralistic society? They were tolerant of religious diversity?
Surprisingly, yes.
Because the popular narrative is usually that they were these aggressive zealots who just hated anyone who didn't worship their specific statues.
In a functional sense, they were highly tolerant as long as your religion didn't interfere with the commerce.
Ah, there it is, the money.
Right. You want to worship a statue? Fine. You want to pray facing Jerusalem? Go for it. You want to be a Christian merchant? Come on in and trade. It was a very pragmatic, live and let live theological environment.
Okay, so if theology wasn't the actual friction point, what was the real threat? Why go to war over this specific message?
Because the true threat was entirely socioeconomic. The message being presented wasn't simply, hey, you should add another invisible deity to your pantheon.
Right.
The message was a direct existential threat to the Mala.
The Mala being the ruling elite, the vested interests, the oligarchs.
Yes, this ruling class had built an incredibly sophisticated, ruthless capitalist system based on the exploitation of the lower classes.
How did they manage that?
They controlled the trade routes, they controlled the debt cycles, and they extracted wealth relentlessly. Parwes describes a system that quite literally squeezed the blood out of the vulnerable.
And I'm guessing the religion played a part in that extraction.
Oh, absolutely. Layered perfectly on top of this economic exploitation was a religious system built entirely on gatekeeping. The elite controlled the holy sites, they controlled the annual pilgrimages, they controlled the rituals.
And therefore, they controlled the massive flow of capital coming into the city.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a tourist trap run by oligarchs.
Ah. It's an interlocking monopoly. The theology was just the marketing department for the economic extraction.
That is a perfect way to phrase it.
So when a message arrives saying that there is one universal objective law, just like the law that moves the shadow, and that under this universal law, all human beings are functionally equal, that isn't a theological debate.
No.
That is an economic earthquake.
It was a social revolution designed to break the chains of dependency. The core, uncompromising message that terrified the Meccan elite was this: no human being has the right to rule over or exploit another human being.
Period.
Period. It aimed to completely abolish human overlordship in all its forms.
I want to translate this into a modern context because I think it makes the stakes so much clearer for the deep dive.
Sure, go ahead.
It's like introducing a decentralized blockchain technology that fundamentally makes the entire global banking system obsolete overnight.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. If you invent a protocol where people can transact securely, fairly, and instantly without any intermediary taking a cut, the major banks are not going to invite you to a polite academic seminar to debate the elegance of your code.
Definitely not.
They're going to use every regulatory agency, every media outlet, and every lever of power they have to destroy you. The Mullah in Mecca didn't care about the philosophical nuances of monotheism.
No, they didn't.
They cared that their monopoly on power, their ability to dictate terms and debt to the lower classes, was being systematically dismantled.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the historical reality. They were defending their supply chains and their socioeconomic dominance. But this brings us to the tactical problem the elite faced.
Okay, what was the tactical problem?
They couldn't defeat the rational system on its merits. If they stood in the public square and tried to argue against the logic of human equality, or tried to argue against the objective laws of nature demonstrated by the shadow, they would lose.
Because the evidence was too democratic.
Exactly. The public could test it for themselves.
Because you can't argue with the shadow. You can't debate gravity. You can't debate the fact that the sun rises and sets, regardless of what the oligarchs command.
So what is the tactical countermeasure? When a vested interest cannot defeat the message, they have to attack the messenger.
The classic ad hominem.
Right. But more importantly, they have to actively suppress the community's capacity to process the democratic evidence. They have to break the public's cognitive architecture.
Which brings us back to the text, specifically verse 41. And this is where Parwez highlights the text, acting as a brilliant sociological diagnostic tool.
Let's hear it.
When the vested interests, the mockers, saw the messenger bringing this data, they didn't present a counterargument regarding the equitable distribution of resources. They didn't debate the mechanics of the shadow. What was their immediate response?
They pointed and asked, "Is this the one God sent?"
It's almost comical, like, is this the guy?
What Parwez points out here is critical to understanding social control. The elite are not running an intellectual evaluation of the data. They are running a social status evaluation of the source.
Which is so common even today.
Extremely common. They are looking at the messenger's lack of elite credentials. They are saying, he isn't wealthy. He isn't part of the inner circle of the Mullah. He doesn't have our institutional backing or our cultural pedigree.
So the data is invalid.
Right, because the messenger didn't meet their heavily gate-kept criteria for elite status. They simply refused to process the evidence he brought.
It is the weaponization of the ad hominem attack on a societal level. They throw out the data because they don't respect the source's social standing.
Exactly.
It's like dismissing a groundbreaking physics paper because the author didn't go to an Ivy League school. Like, oh, you don't have the right letters after your name, so we are completely absolved from having to look at the shadow you're pointing at.
And this deliberate suppression of reason leads to one of the most intense and, frankly, most often misunderstood diagnoses in the entire text. This is verse 44.
Okay.
The text asks, Am tazabu ana aktaram yazmayuna ayakluna in hum elakaranami bal hum akrusabila. Which translates to, do you think most of them hear or reason? They're like cattle, in fact, more stray than cattle.
Hold on. Let me step in here as the proxy for the skeptical listener.
Please do.
Because you are worse than cattle sounds an awful lot like a standard ancient religious insult.
It does.
It sounds like a 7th century diss track. Like, are we sure we aren't just reading a frustrated leader calling his political opponents a bunch of dumb animals? How does Parwez rescue this from being just an emotionally charged insult?
By analyzing the specific functional mechanics of the Arabic terminology used. Parwez is very explicit that we cannot read this with religious sentimentality or as a moral judgment.
Okay, so what is it then?
It is a chillingly accurate, functional description of a failing system. To understand this, we have to look at how the text defines human cognitive architecture.
The human operating system.
Right. The human operating system relies on two primary functions mentioned in the verse. Sam, which is the ability to hear or receive a signal from the environment, and akal, which is the ability to reason, to process that signal and extract meaning.
Input and processing.
Exactly. Together, these form the human discriminative apparatus.
You take in data from your environment, like the shadow moving the Mew, you run it through the processor of human reason, and you output a logical decision about how to navigate your reality.
That is the baseline functional requirement of human mind.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, compare that to the cattle. Cattle do not possess akal. They do not have complex, abstract human reason.
Right.
But their biological systems work perfectly according to their functional instincts, which the text refers to as jibbalat. A cow receives a signal, say, the sight of a predator or the smell of a water source, and its instinctual programming processes that input flawlessly to generate the correct survival output.
It runs away or it walks to the water and drinks.
Right. The animal operates exactly as its internal system was designed to operate.
So a cow is a perfectly functioning cow and might not be doing calculus, but its hardware and software are perfectly aligned for its environment.
But what happens when a human community is socially conditioned by its elite to intentionally suppress its own discriminative apparatus?
Oh, man.
When a society is trained to care so deeply about social status, credentials, and institutional gatekeeping that they let universally available democratic evidence pass them by without engaging with it.
The system crashes, the visual input of the shadow is there, but the processing chip has been intentionally turned off by the user.
And therefore, they fall functionally below the state of animals. A cow responds correctly to its environment.
Sure.
A brainwashed human society does not.
Wow.
A human who refuses to use reason in the presence of abundant evidence is operating a broken system. They have lost a basic navigational capacity that pre-rational animals still retain. It is not an insult. It is a devastatingly logical systems diagnosis.
That reframing is profound. I mean, it's not saying you are bad, immoral people. It is saying your hardware is perfectly fine, but you have allowed a social virus to completely corrupt your software, to the point where a biological automaton driven purely by instinct is outperforming you in basic reality testing.
And this leads Parwez to ask a vital follow-up question. What causes a human being's cognitive architecture to crash so completely? What exactly is the virus?
Yeah, how does an entire society get to a point where they willingly suppress their own reason and fall below the operational baseline of cattle?
We've established that the elite engineered this environment to protect their monopolies.
Right, but how do they actually hack the human mind to make the public comply? What is the psychological mechanism of this system failure?
To answer that, Parwez delves into the psychosocial analysis provided in the source. The text asks a very pointed question. Have you seen the one who takes his own desires as his God?
Interesting phrasing.
The term used here is Hawa, which encompasses human emotion, unchecked desire, deep-seated biases, and vested interests.
Taking your own bias as your God, that is a brilliant ancient articulation of cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. You are worshiping your own preconceived notions.
Exactly. The source material uses an incredibly powerful analogy here to explain the physical mechanics of Hawa. It compares it to intoxication.
The drunkard analogy. Let's explore the mechanics of that.
Sure.
If someone is heavily intoxicated with alcohol, they lose their senses temporarily, they stagger, they can't accurately judge distance, they might speak incoherently. Their processing system is impaired by an external chemical agent. But eventually, the liver processes the alcohol, the chemical leaves the bloodstream, the brain clears, and they return to a baseline state of rationality. They wake up the next morning and can say, wow, the data I was processing last night was completely wrong. I made terrible decisions.
But Parwez argues that a person who is intoxicated by their own unchecked desires, by their Hawa, is in a significantly more dangerous state.
Because they don't know they're drunk.
Exactly. Because they don't look drunk. They might wear a bespoke suit, hold a prestigious degree, and speak very eloquently on television. But internally, their cognitive architecture is compromised.
They have become functionally deaf, dumb, and blind on a permanent systemic level.
Their vast knowledge and intellect become completely useless because their emotional drive has violently hijacked the steering wheel.
The virus has disguised itself as the operating system. They genuinely think they are being rational, but every single decision is just a post hoc rationalization of what their ego, their social status, or their wallet already wanted to do.
This is where Parwes makes a seamless connection to modern psychoanalysis. He points out that even when human beings try their absolute hardest to make purely rational, objective decisions,
Like in a democracy.
yeah, let's say in a democratic voting process, or a corporate boardroom, or even a peer-reviewed scientific committee, hidden emotions and subconscious biases always taint the result. The psychoanalyst can look at a seemingly objective, mathematically sound decision and trace it back to a hidden fear, a childhood conditioning, or an unacknowledged desire for status within the mullah.
So the terrifying conclusion here is that pure, unadulterated human objectivity is a myth.
Within the closed system of the human mind, yes. If human intellect is the only metric, Hawa will always inevitably leak into the equation. There will always be some percentage of bias skewing the data.
If you are listening to this right now, you might be feeling a bit of friction, because I'm feeling it.
I'm sure.
If our internal navigational systems are inherently compromised by our own subconscious biases, how do we ever chart a true course? If the compass is magnetically drawn to our own ego, how do we avoid driving the ship into the rocks?
It's a great question.
And more importantly, if we promise at the start of this deep dive not to do theology, how does Parwes solve this without just saying, well, pray about it?
He solves it through the systemic function of wahi, which translates to divine revelation. But Parwes strips away the mystical aura entirely and frames it as an objective external data set. Wahi is introduced as the only data set completely free from human emotional distortion. It contains 0% Hawa.
Okay, walk me through the sociology of that. How does an ancient text serve as objective data for a modern systems engineer?
The source material uses the analogy of desert travelers to explain this. Imagine you are navigating a vast, featureless desert at night. You cannot rely on your internal sense of direction. The sand dunes shift with the wind, altering the landscape. The wind plays tricks on your ears. More importantly, your fatigue and your intense thirst, your internal Hawa, will literally cause your brain to hallucinate an oasis where there is only sand.
Right, mirages.
If you follow your internal compass, you will walk in circles until you die.
Your internal hardware is actively lying to you because of its own biases and survival panics. So what is the alternative? You look up, you use the stars.
You navigate by the stars because the stars are completely indifferent to your desires. The stars do not change their fixed objective path just because you are tired, or because you want the journey to end, or because you hold a high social status.
They don't negotiate with your ego.
No, they don't. They provide a pure, uncompromised external navigational beacon. A civilization, Parvez argues, must use the permanent values of Wahi in the exact same way. It is the objective external coordinate system required to correct the constant, inevitable drift caused by human bias.
It's the ultimate external anchor. You triangulate your position against something that cannot be corrupted by the mala.
Exactly.
But what happens when a society makes the collective institutional choice to ignore the objective data? What happens when they follow their compromised emotional biases, their Hawa, instead of the fixed coordinates? Does the universe step in to punish them?
This introduces the concept of the law of requital, or mukafat amal. And to understand the mechanics of this law, we return to the very first piece of democratic evidence we discussed.
The shadow.
The shadow.
We circle back to the shadow. It's the ultimate teacher.
The shadow is the law of requital made visible in physical form. Think about how the shadow operates. It moves according to consistent, measurable, non-negotiable principles.
Right?
Now imagine the Meccan elite, the oligarchs, standing in the sun. They can pass decrees in their assembly. They can mock the messenger who points at the shadow. They can boast about their massive wealth. They can legally refuse to acknowledge the sun's movement. Does any of that socio-political maneuvering change the length of the shadow?
Not a millimeter. The shadow doesn't care about their net worth or their legislation.
The rational order of the universe operates with what the text calls kabak yasser, which translates to an easy, effortless functioning. It draws the shadow back effortlessly, completely, regardless of human engagement, ignorance, or arrogance.
This is a crucial distinction. If a community refuses to apply reason to the evidence around them, they aren't actually harming the shadow, they aren't hurting the universe, they're only destroying their own capacity to survive within that universe.
Which means the law of requital is emphatically not about a wrathful deity sitting on a cloud throwing lightning bolts at sinners. Parwes strips all of that mythology away. The law of requital is simply the physics of consequence applied to human actions. It is a differential outcome, based on systemic failure.
I want to use a structural engineering analogy here because I think it locks this concept in perfectly.
Go for it.
Imagine you are building a massive suspension bridge. The laws of physics, tension, and load-bearing capacities are fixed, objective realities just like the shadow. But the lead engineer's ego won't let him admit he doesn't understand the math, and the construction company wants to save money on materials. Their Hawa, their vested interests, override the objective data.
A recipe for disaster.
Exactly. When that bridge inevitably collapses a year later, the universe didn't punish them. Gravity didn't target them out of anger. Gravity just did what gravity always does effortlessly. The collapse is the accumulated mathematical consequence of their own ignorance and arrogance.
That is the exact mechanism. The law of requital does not penalize ignorance externally. It operates through the accumulated consequences of the decisions that ignorance enables.
Right.
A community that cannot read the consistent patterns of its environment because its discriminative capacity has been suppressed, because they're acting like the cattle we discussed earlier, will inevitably make consistently worse decisions than a community that uses reason.
Over time, these bad decisions accumulate in the social architecture. The friction builds, the economic inefficiencies compound, the wealth inequality tears at the social fabric until the system simply collapses under its own weight.
It is the math playing out over time. It's the interplay of permanence and change. The permanent laws of the universe remain, while the changing human societies either align with those laws and thrive, or ignore them and break themselves against reality.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of Carwaz's lecture, and a truly majestic metaphor that maps this rational order perfectly onto the physical world. It shows how this objective law can actually breathe life back into a dead, collapsed system.
The distillation of life. Lecture 10 culminates with this massive, sweeping analogy regarding the water cycle, based on verse 48.
Yeah.
Let's break down the thermodynamics of this metaphor because it ties everything we've talked about together.
Let's do it.
The source starts by looking at the ocean. The ocean is vast, it is incredibly powerful, covers most of the earth, but it is entirely salty. You cannot drink it.
No, you definitely can't.
If you try to sustain a human society on ocean water alone, you will die of dehydration. It is full of unusable, even toxic elements if consumed directly.
This ocean represents the vast sea of human thought, human culture, and human history. It is full of incredible potential and raw power, but it is heavily contaminated with Hawa. It's full of our biases, our egos, and the toxicity of our exploitative systems.
Exactly. But then, the physical laws of the universe engage. The sun's heat beats down on the ocean. Through the effortless process of evaporation, the pure water molecules are lifted up, while the salt, the heavy toxins, and the impurities are left behind in the sea.
Nature's filtration system?
Right. This pure, distilled water rises into the atmosphere and gathers into clouds.
It is an ecosystem of purification. Just as the physical laws distill pure water, store it in the clouds, and then rain it down proportionally on dead, barren land to bring forth new life. The objective laws of Wahi distill pure truth, completely separating it from the heavy salt of human ego and the toxicity of the mala.
It separates the life-giving principles from human bias. And here is the actionable conclusion for the listener, the application of all this theory. Parwaz points out that the individuals and communities who align themselves with this objective system do not just become passive recipients of this distilled rain.
What do they become?
They become what the text metaphorically calls water skins.
I find the water skin analogy so fascinating because a water skin isn't a flood. A flood destroys the land. A water skin is a controlled, deliberate mechanism.
Exactly. A water skin is a vessel of preservation and precise distribution. Those who internalize the objective data, who fight through their own biases and train their discriminative apparatus, their Sam Akil, become like these vessels.
Wow.
They store their capacities, their intellectual resources, their economic energy, and they dispense them exactly when and where the environment needs them. They don't waste energy on ego-driven displays or status-seeking within a corrupt system.
They apply the distilled truth, the pure water, to the specific dead areas of their society, bringing those barren, collapsed systems back to life.
They become the agents of systemic revival. They look past the gatekeepers to see the democratic evidence of the shadow. They process that data without the intoxication of bias.
Because they understand that the universe operates on effortless laws of consequence. And they apply the pure, distilled solutions to the structural failures around them.
It is a complete, closed-loop system of civilizational mechanics, presented not as mystical dogma, but as observable, reproducible reality.
Let's step back and look at the incredible ground we've covered today in this deep dive. We started by exploding the myth of credentialed meaning, recognizing that the ultimate form of social control isn't hiding the evidence, but convincing you that you need an elite interpreter to understand it.
Right, the whole "you can't understand it without us" narrative.
Exactly. We looked at how the universe offers open source, democratic evidence, like the non negotiable movement of the shadow that bypasses those gatekeepers entirely.
We analyze how the ruling class in Mecca fought this rational framework not over theology, but to protect their socioeconomic monopolies and their exploitation of the vulnerable.
Right. And we explored the chilling diagnostic of communities that suppress their own reason to worship the false god of their own biases, functionally dropping below the operational baseline of instinct-driven cattle.
We saw how the law of requital isn't divine revenge, but the effortless compounding physics of consequence. The bridge collapsing under the weight of its own bad math.
And finally, we looked at how objective truth acts like the water cycle, distilling pure life out of a toxic ocean to revive dead societies through deliberate, focused action.
It is a masterclass in systems thinking applied to human survival, mapping the internal psychology of the individual to the macro collapse of civilizations.
It really is an astonishing framework when you strip away the historical baggage and look at the underlying mechanics. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to hand it over for one final thought, because understanding all this theory is one thing, but sitting with its implications is another.
The final provocative thought I want to leave you with to mull over as you go about your day is this. The text tells us that the rational order of the universe operates effortlessly, completely indifferent to our ignorance or our arrogance.
Doesn't care.
Right. The sun will rise, and the shadow will extend and contract tomorrow, whether you study it, whether you argue about it on the internet, or whether you completely ignore it. The physical laws of consequence are already in motion.
So what's the real question?
The question isn't whether those consequences are coming for our modern civilization. The universe guarantees they are. The real question you must ask yourself is, are we currently operating with the functional, unbiased awareness to read the data? Or are we just cattle standing on the train tracks, demanding to see the oncoming train's credentials?